The Australian Financial Review.
What level do you think it'll come down to if you haven't?
It'll come down substantially, but it won't be zero. It used to be zero. We were just destroyed China.
After imposing the highest tariffs on China in over 100 years, US President Donald Trump is confident of doing a deal.
They're going to do very well, and I think they're going to be happy, and I think we're going to live together very happily and ideally work together. So I think it's going to work out very well.
Trump's comments came after Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent told a private investors conference that a deal would be reached in the very near future. But he also admitted negotiations would be a slog. Still, it was a note of optimism for an uncertain world. The International Monetary Fund this week warned of a significant slowdown in global growth because of the US-China trade war. And the IMF cut its growth forecast for the Australian economy by a hefty 0.5 percentage point this year.
Anything that harms China's economic growth harms Australia, and that will be felt most immediately and directly on iron ore exports to China.
Welcome to The Fin. I'm Lisa Murray. Today, Financial Review columnist and former ambassador to China, Geoff Raby, on the US-China trade war, what it means for Australia, and why Beijing and Washington will do a deal. It's Thursday, April 24. Geoff, China and the US have had trade tensions for years. Trump ratcheted up tariffs during his first term as president. But this time's different. This is an all-out China-US trade war. Trump's paused reciprocal tariffs for other countries, but he's lifted them to 145% for China. He says cheap Chinese imports have hollowed out American factories, that China steals US technology, and its $300 billion trade surplus shows that it hasn't played by the global trade rules. Does Trump have a point?
Well, he certainly has a point about the hollowing out of US manufacturing, but this has been a 20, 30-year trend around the world as many developing countries have become participants in the international economy. China has just outperformed everyone else in terms of expanding its manufacturing, becoming a dominant powerhouse of global manufacturing. But it's not just about manufacturing, of course. The US has a big services trade surplus with China, so we can't just focus on trade in goods. And the services trade surplus that the US runs reflects the fact that over those 20 or 30 years that manufacturing has been hollowed out in the US economy has restructured and become a much more services-based, technology-based and driven economy. And bilateral imbalances really say nothing about whether someone's played by the global rules or not. The bilateral imbalances reflect differences in savings and investment between the respective countries. So the thing Trump's really focusing on, I think, very much is the US's own trade deficit and its own debt. And the two things are connected. So it spends far more than it saves, and it has to borrow that savings, and the spending goes on production overseas because the US can't produce itself domestically all that it wishes to consume. And that's why you have this massive imbalance. But Trump is just, as we know, playing the populist card. I saw a poll the other day where, yes, 80% of the people in the US would like to see some reshoring of US manufacturing, but only 20% of people in the US would want to work in manufacturing.
And now we have these tit-for-tat tariffs, neither side's backing down. China's imposed tariffs on US imports of 125%, but China's economy already has its own challenges. You've been back and forth to China this year. What do you think the impact of this trade fight is going to be on the economy and on public morale?
I think on the economy, you'd have to expect that there would be some dampening effect on economic growth. Now, the first quarter numbers for China this year are surprisingly good.
China's economy grew much faster than expected at the start of this year, boosted by its firm focus on manufacturing.
5.4%, beat all forecasts by the experts. And so that shows that consumer demand and consumer confidence is beginning to return. even though, it's been knocked badly by the property downturn. So there is a buoyancy in the economy, but I would think that this would probably knock a percentage point or two off China's economic growth for this year. But as for morale, people in China have been anticipating this, and I found on recent visits that there was quite a firmness in attitude and almost, if it's going to happen, bring it on. But what it's doing is just supporting, if you like, the nationalist narrative of the Communist Party, which always seeks legitimacy by saying that the world's against China and only the Communist Party can keep China safe and together and so on. So I think for Xi Jinping and the party, at this particular time, when China's economy itself is going through a lot of adjustment, it's very helpful for the Communist Party to have an external threat like this, and it plays into the narrative that the United States just wants to contain China. And of course, this plays out well for Xi Jinping. He's seen by the Chinese people as standing firm, standing up to the United States. It plays into his strong leadership profile that he's carefully tried to cultivate through the course of his term.
So then what levers does China have to support the economy during the trade war? What can it do to spur domestic consumption and consumer sentiment?
A number of things. One, the old fiscal policy levers. They can expand central budgetary expenditures and so on. Two, they can reduce interest rates, and they have started to reduce the discount rates. They can depreciate the renminbi, make their exports more competitive in other markets. Then they've got regulatory measures. For example, when the housing market was very hot, they introduced a whole lot of measures to cool it down, including restricting the number of investment properties one could have, and a lot of restrictions on foreigners owning property. So they've got a number of those sorts of regulatory things around the housing sector they can ease. And that is very important in terms of boosting consumer confidence.
But what about the long-term planning that China has done to prepare itself for a China-US trade war? As we said, they knew what Trump was about during his first term as president. They knew this might be coming. How have they been preparing?
Well, they've done a number of things. Firstly, in China today, there's massive restructuring of the economy. They've been getting rid of low value-added, labour-intensive manufacturing. Now, they still do a lot, and the Trump tariffs will harm those industries in particular, toy making, footwear, that sort of stuff. But a lot of that for years now has been moving just under the pressure of relative price changes, the market working, moving to low-cost countries, neighbouring countries, Bangladesh, Vietnam, Malaysia, and so on. And we've seen that, and we also have seen that those countries have had very big increases in their exports to the United States. So moving production to third countries is a very important, has been an important part of this building resilience. But also there's a whole range of new industries emerging that China is becoming dominant globally. Electric vehicles.
You're just seeing the Chinese competition for Tesla just sort of going from strength to strength here.
Technologies and products needed for the green transition, like solar panels.
When it comes to solar power, China is outpacing everyone. Last year, it commissioned as much solar energy as the entire world did in 2022.
China dominates world markets in all of those things, and they're all the future growth areas. But also, Beijing has been very active in building its relations with what's called the Global South and taking a decision that the future for China's economy doesn't lie in exporting lots of goods to the developed world, but much more to what we used to call the developing world or the Global South. And this has been working. If you look at the share of China's exports going to the United States since 2018, which is about in the middle of when Trump started his Trump 1.0 trade measures against China, China's exports to the United States have fallen from 23% of China's total exports to 14% today. And 2.8% of China's economic growth is accounted for by those exports to the US. So what we're seeing now emerging in the world is, if you like, two orders loosely formed, one around the United States, which we know, and the new one is really around China, and Australia finds itself very much located still in the US-led order, even though our trade and economic interests are now with the China-led order.
Geoff, we've been talking about how China is responding to Trump's tariff increases, and you've suggested one of the ways it's dealing with the trade war is to strengthen economic relationships with other countries in the region. Just last week, Xi Jinping went on a tour of Southeast Asia as part of that. But how difficult will it be for Beijing, given those countries are now also negotiating with the US to ensure they aren't hit with higher tariffs?
We'll have to watch this space, I have to say. It's hard to envisage how this plays out because, and I'm hesitating, Lisa, because China is the biggest market for all of these economies. China is the number one trading partner, and the US is not trading in what China trades in. So it's hard to see that these countries will be forced into diverting their trade substantially away from China. But the US certainly is a big and rich market, and that gives the US enormous leverage. But I think a lot of these countries are so deeply integrated now with China that they're not going to break those relationships in order to access the US market. I just really think you need to look at case by case. I don't think it's easy to generalize across all of these US trading partners. They're all in a very different position with respect to the US and China.
You also talked about the two trade and economic groupings that are emerging in the world, one loosely based around the US and one based around China, and that Australia is in the US-led grouping. So how do you see the trade war affecting Australia?
Well, starting with the economy, of course, anything that harms China's economic growth harms Australia, and that will be felt most immediately and directly on iron ore exports to China. But something that really no one seems to be focusing on at present is that this also creates many opportunities for Australia's exporters into China. Wine, beef, lumber, gas, coal. These are all big US exports to China, which presumably now will not be sold to China. And they're all things that we have a strong comparative advantage in, and we can fill that gap. Ironically, they're the same sorts of things that the US went to China with to fill the gap that was created by the Chinese measures against us a few years ago. So we'll be getting market share back, and maybe we can increase our market share in those areas. And the other irony, of course, is that it just will make us even more dependent on the Chinese market and less diversified.
So that's the economic impact. How will it affect the way Australia manages its relationships with the two most powerful countries in the world?
Well, the Australian government's done a good job in re-establishing relations with China after the Morrison government, and I think there's some important lessons there for us in terms of how to manage that relationship. And the Prime Minister Albanese has been very clear about doing away with megaphone diplomacy.
My position on the relationship with China remains a consistent one. We'll cooperate where we can, we'll disagree where we must, and we'll engage in our national interest.
However, the problem we have with this is that most of our actions really show that we have made a choice to support US primacy in the region. And there is, I think, a problem in how we're managing the relationship. So AUKUS, the Quad, all of that are effectively saying we support US primacy over China in the region, and we identify our security with US maintaining primacy. It's arguable that we need US primacy to be secure, but equally it's increasingly questioned whether US will maintain primacy, whether it can. With rising China, people like Hugh White, for example, would argue that it's just not feasible, even if America wanted to do that. And I suggest that Trump doesn't really care about or know about US exceptionalism, which has been the fundamental strand running through US foreign policy for over a century. And if you are not focused on exceptionalism, you don't need primacy. And it may well be, and this sounds polyanderish at the present, it may well be that Trump could find a way of negotiating with China a division of labour in the world, if you like, to provide China strategic space. So we might find ourselves having put our foreign policy on the side of maintaining US primacy somewhat isolated in that. And particularly from our major trading relationship, which is, of course, China. So The solution to us, it seems to me, is that we really need to have much more agile and smart diplomacy to basically navigate our way through these very difficult and competing challenges that we face. But I think the trick is for diplomacy is to recognise the differences, understand why they're there, and then try and navigate your way around them. Because we can't get away from the fact that our interests are so deeply tied up with China. China now takes 37% of our exports. We trade so much with China because of the comparative advantage between our economies that we just are so compatible. We have lots of stuff they want, and they've got lots of consumers that we want to sell our stuff to. That's basically the fundamental economics, which is called comparative advantage. That's the reality. And if we want to trade less with China, it's like what Trump's going to try and do, then accept that we will be poorer for doing so. And I don't think many politicians are prepared to stand up and say, okay, we want to make ourselves poorer.
And Geoff, we are in the middle of a federal election campaign. There's been some talk of China around the edges, particularly when Chinese warships were sailing around Australia. But why do you think the relationship hasn't been a focus in this campaign?
Well, it's like a conspiracy of silence between the major parties. And I think that comes out of the last election, which was held at a time that our relations with China were in the toilet, and that the Chinese community attributed that very much to Prime Minister Morrison.
The Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, is demanding the Chinese government delete what he's described as a repugnant tweet attacking the Australian Defence Force.
Their bellicose rhetoric and their anti-China rhetoric.
The Chinese government should be totally ashamed of this post. The Chinese government has not denounced what is occurring in Ukraine, and I would urge the Chinese government to denounce those actions.
And I think to that extent, the coalitions learnt that you don't talk about China, and I think they're working very hard to try and get some of those Chinese-Australian votes back. Have we got the right strategy? Well, yes. I mean, if it's better that China's not a partisan football in the election campaign, but I think we do need some better leadership. So, for example, the 3 Chinese ships that were erroneously called flotilla and were in international waters, well, really, I mean, we need our leaders to be saying, well, this is what is going to happen in future to Australia because China's becoming a global power, and global powers project power globally, just as the United States has done since the beginning of the 20th century. It doesn't threaten Australian security. So this is our changed security environment. This is the new sort of operating environment that we've got to face. And I think we need better leadership in Australia to actually explain and not scare the Australian community into hasty and possibly counterproductive behaviour and reactions. We do need to keep the rhetoric down. I think that's been managed fairly well throughout the course of the campaign. But it doesn't help us for China being the name which one shall not use. We need to have a much more open discussion about how we fit with China.
But the timing of those ships circumnavigating Australia was provocative, wasn't it?
Well, only if they hadn't been watching. If you're in a state of denial, yes, you'll have that response. I thought the Prime Minister's response was actually very good because he did say that, well, of course, we have sail-throughs in the South China Sea and we sail through the Straits of Taiwan. And yes, the provocation, if you like, was that China was reminding Australia that we do the same. Now, you could argue the legal technical niceties of whether the South China Sea sail-throughs are through international waters or contested waters, but the point is that sail through the Tasman looked to me very much like China was sending us a message saying, look, you do it, we do it.
Finally, Geoff, you've been a trade negotiator, chief China diplomat, and have a consulting business focused on China. How do you think this US-China trade war will play out?
I think there will be some high theatre and drama for some time. I think there'll be some real costs to China if it shaves a percentage point or so off China's economic growth. That, of course, will harm us as well, that anything that harms the Chinese economy is bad for Australia. That's just a fact of life, coming from that great trade dependency. But often negotiations between states require a lot of theatre. Leaders have to carry their people along with them. And I see China's appointed a new special trade negotiator to deal with the United States. So that's very telling. then I think there's already behind the scenes a lot of thinking and discussions even going ahead about what a landing might look like. And for the Chinese, it may be possible to do some of these things relatively costless. And think about this, like Trump 1.0, we had the theatre, nothing as dramatic as what we're just going through now. But eventually, after 9 months, they negotiated some bilateral deal. And China's exports to the United States, despite all of that, had continued to grow right up until now. And I think for the Chinese, well, they will be prepared to work on finding some politically saleable outcomes for Trump that give him face and looks like a victory for the United States, but won't actually change very much on the ground. And only with the benefit of hindsight will we know that. But I think if you look at what happened with Trump 1.0, then not much changed as a result of all of Trump's huffing and puffing back then.
Thanks, Geoff.
Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you for listening to The Fin. I'm Lisa Murray, with Financial Review columnist and former ambassador to China, Geoff Raby, joining the podcast today. The Fin is produced by Alex Gao. Lap Fan is head of podcast. Fiona Buffini is head of premium content. Our theme is by Alex Gao. If you like the show and want to hear more, follow us wherever you get your podcasts and consider rating and reviewing us, as it helps others find us. And don't forget to listen on Tuesday to the last of our special podcasts, Election 2025, when political editor Phil Curry and our expert panel will give their predictions of what's going to happen on voting day. For more stories about markets, business and power, subscribe to the Financial Review at afr.com/subscribe. See you next week.
The Australian Financial Review.